Good evening and welcome. I am Melanie Ramey, the chair of the board of the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this special program. Before we begin this evening's program, I do want to take a minute to talk about the next program, which will be on January the 7th. This is a very interesting program that I know many of you will want to attend and invite others to attend. This will be a dinner meeting at the Madison Club, and you will be receiving information about how to pre-register for this special meeting. This will be our first opportunity to meet in person in almost 2 years, as you know. I also want to explain to you that this is a package deal. You must come to the dinner in order to hear the presentation. You cannot just walk in at the last minute, and you cannot just come for the presentation and not the dinner. So keep that in mind as you receive information about it. The speaker for that event will be Dr. Jeremy Suri. Dr. Suri is the Mac Brown Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Texas in Austin. And many of you remember him from when he was on the faculty here at the UW in Madison. Since then, he has continued to speak and write widely. He is the author or editor of 10 books. And I think he is always a fascinating speaker. And I'm sure that you will want to be preparing to attend this special meeting. So think about it and think about inviting people that you would also know would be interested. And, you know, as a matter of fact, if there are people you don't know what to give for holiday presents for Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever, you might give them the gift of inviting them to the dinner and also being able to hear Dr. Suri. He will be speaking about or giving an overview of the rise of authoritarianism and asking the question, is it the future or does it present a phase that democracies will have to tolerate? So this is, of course, an extremely timely topic, and I think there's be a lot of interest in it. So you'll be sure and want to get your reservation in early, so you'll be able to attend. Now let's move on to also our interesting topic for this evening, which is the global aspects of trade and security, from export controls to Madison, Wisconsin. And we are very fortunate to have with us Jay Nash. Jay Nash is the president of the Madison International Trade Association. And he has also founded the Nash Global Trade Services Corporation, of which he is the founder and principal. Jay has worked with a wide range of businesses in many areas of business, helping them to navigate the U.S. export controls and requirements, as well as the foreign ones. He has worked in over 40 countries and is fluent in spoken Mandarin Chinese. I hope he's not going to speak in Mandarin Chinese tonight, because I wouldn't be able to understand a word. But in any event, he has lived and worked in Beijing, China, and is very knowledgeable about what is going on there. Jay took his Juris Doctor degree from the University of Iowa School of Law. His master's is from the Georgetown School of Social Security, and his bachelor's from the University of Michigan. So he is a well-traveled and well-educated and well-experienced person to speak with us this evening on the global aspects of trade and security. If you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, when you can see the place where to click on for the chat will open on the right side, and you will put your questions there. And when he has finished his presentation, I will ask the questions. So please keep that in mind. And as questions occur to you, just enter them in the chat area and I will get them. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jay Nash.
Thank you, Melanie. And I wanted to say thank you to the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations for having me for this program tonight. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. I recall it wasn't very long ago that I first connected with the MCFR and Roy Christensen and yourself and others to explore how the Madison International Trade Association and the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations could strengthen their relationship. And I think that in many ways I'll start with that, and I think hopefully I'll end up there, because I think that is going to be a key aspect of not only the global aspects of trade and security, but also how they relate to Madison, all of us right here in Madison, Wisconsin, and those who work with us and are in our community. So as Melanie mentioned, I am going to spend a good part of my time talking to you about the global aspects of trade and security. And I'm going to do that in the context of the area that I work mostly in, and that is in export controls and compliance. And what I'll do is I want to provide a very brief introduction, without making it too academic. I think there are some things, though, to lay a kind of a baseline for that will lead to further discussion as we get into our program tonight. And I want to look at not only what these are and how they connect to global trade and security, but why we see countries putting emphasis and employing export controls in a variety of ways, not only security per se, but also as a tool of foreign policy more broadly, and of course, a tool of commercial policy as well. We'll kind of start in general, and then I want to go out, given the global theme of this program, and look at the quotes world of export controls, and look beyond the U.S. and see what are some of the global trends, what are some happening in other countries of the world in this space, and why we see global export controls almost everywhere, it seems like today. You may not realize it if it's not something that you have been following quite as closely, but maybe I'll highlight a few things and you realize, wow, export controls are seemingly everywhere these days. So then I'll kind of come back and look at export controls' place in global trade and security today, how it is being used in some, how should I say, more hard ways, maybe even in some negative ways, in terms of being at the center of international conflicts or international disagreements, but also trying to look at the other side of that and how export controls, I think, are being utilized in a positive way in international relations and global trade and security today. And then finally, I want to come back and tie it back to all of us here in Madison, Wisconsin, and those that are work with us and know us so well, and look at some of the ways that Madison can continue to connect with the global aspects of trade and security through organizations like MITA, like the MCFR, and others. And hopefully, and we should have plenty of times for your questions and discussion. So you've already, I think, done this, and I want to put this up here more to kind of give you more about the perspective I'm coming from, so you can kind of understand and maybe appreciate some of my comments and some of my remarks going forward. So, and I think, if you look at, and I look at kind of what I've done and where I've come from, it's very much reflective of what export controls are all about. Their export controls really are at the intersection of a number of different areas and disciplines and aspects, everything from law to foreign affairs to technology to international security, and really, that's what I think that you see reflected in some of the work and some of the experiences that I have. Some of the things that I do now. And so when I speak about export controls, I really do try and look at it from, both more traditional legal regulatory aspects, from international relations aspects and international affairs aspects, but also trade, business, and commerce aspects as well. And then again, I hope, some of these experiences that I have reflect that. So how do I like to think about export controls? What are they? And basically, I think it was perfect to describe and promote this event as the global aspects of trade and security, because I think export controls are one of the most global aspects of trade and security. In fact, you often hear export controls as being the place where global trade and security intersect. Now, a little bit more technically speaking, what are they? They are policies, rules, restrictions, procedures, the kind of requirements that you heard Melanie refer to. They apply to trade, business, science, and technology activities. So, most commonly, given their name, exports of goods, but as you'll see, they've expanded beyond just traditional shipments out of a country of physical items to capture a whole broader set of activities, including financing, including technology cooperation, and even including some cases, other types of activities that natural and individual persons might engage in. So they've really kind of expanded in scope over the last several decades. And basically they are, the way they're structured they apply to not only to items in today's practice, but also, as I mentioned, individuals, countries, and things that may have a weapon, military, terrorism, or anti-human rights nexus of some kind. So that's kind of why they exist. That's kind of where they figure in. And you can tell by, that's a pretty broad definition. That's why you'll hear me come back to saying that you really can see export controls more or less everywhere you go these days. So, again, I don't want to put them in a negative light, because the same things that export controls touch on in global trade and security, the people, the places, the items, the countries, I'd say, 99 days out of 100, they are peaceful, they are civilian, they are commercial, they are beneficial. But there is, unfortunately, this small percentage where an item can be used in a bad way, by a bad person, in a bad place, for a bad reason, to kind of really put it crudely. And that's really why export controls exist and why we talk about them today. So just to kind of build on the theme of export controls really being at the intersection, and why I find it really such an interesting area, such a fascinating area. I think in most cases, when somebody says export controls, said it to you or to someone else, your eyes glaze over, headaches come on, and there's, immediate disinterest, and it doesn't seem that exciting. Well, hopefully, as you can already tell, I'm certainly excited about it. And I think it's an absolutely exciting area, fascinating area, because of kind of this structure that you see here. It does touch on all of these areas and kind of exists where they all intersect, but it also can be a pathway, a springboard to any one of them. So, in reality, when I got into export controls, it was because I was interested in US-China relations going back to the mid-1990s. I was interested in law, and I was interested in international security. And, really, I kind of at the center of all those things, I kept coming across export controls in the dynamics of those different relationships and how those different areas coalesced. And at the same time, at any point, if I want to explore one of those areas a little bit more broadly, I can kind of leave the central hub of export controls and go down any one of those paths and look more at legal regulatory issues, look more at foreign policy issues, look at security issues, look at technology issues. So that's really why I think of a way to think about export controls, and why I think that really they are kind of a very fascinating area. So I think that's also, I think informs why countries have these export controls in place, these policies, procedures that apply to people and technology and certain types of items. because they may be related to weapons on one day, but could be used for a purpose, perfectly peaceful purpose, beneficial purpose on most other days. And so here are some of the reasons. I think they're probably not that earth-shattering. They're fairly sensible because of national security, as well as international security. But also it's because now there's formed a kind of an international set of standards and norms and legal obligations that countries want to meet. But also going beyond that, I think countries are looking at as a tool to bolster their international reputation and also to promote economic and other national interests, including safeguarding critical technology. So these are all the reasons why, some countries have had export controls in place for a very long time. Others, and increasingly with increasing pace, you're seeing more and more countries introduce national export control systems. And it could be led by one of these reasons, more of a security reason or an international security reason. It could be led because of more of an international obligation reason, or some combination of all of these reasons together. In terms of how they're implemented, in a very practical way, as I mentioned, it could be a set of rules and regulations that maybe one or more, or in the case of US, 17 different, I think maybe at least 17, but could be as many as 34 different US government agencies touch upon export controls in some way, shape, or form, whether it's the licensing aspect of it, which is a very key part of export controls, because that kind of combination of factors that I mentioned, the who, what, where, why of a business transaction or activity, what that's going to determine at the end of the day is, do you need to get some kind of government permission or meet some kind of regulatory requirement before that activity or that action can take place? And in most cases, what that authorization is in the form of a license. So just in the same way you need to get a license to drive, go hunting, fishing, open a business in some cases, that's in the simplest form what export controls are all about. You can trade in most anything you'd like, but for certain things and with certain people involved or certain countries, you can still do the trade. You just need to get a license before you do so. And so that's kind of how you see most governments implement their export controls. Now, of course, it's not all that simple. There does come with penalties. It includes criminal penalties, monetary fines. You can lose trade privileges if you don't comply with the export controls in the proper way. So compliance has become a really critical part of export controls and how it's manifested and practiced in a commercial context and in a business context. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that element has really also taken on a life of its own and in many ways generated the growth of export controls that we see as much as government practice. In my view, what you see a lot in the world of export controls, in the world of trade and security, is being engendered and is being advanced by business practices and business best practices and commercial best practices as much as it is government policy. So that's a theme and an issue we can come back to in a little bit. But export controls is not a new thing also. That's another point I want to make. It's been around since the time of ancient China, maybe even earlier, when there was a series of warring states and other moments in ancient Chinese history. There were also those advances in certain metals and items that the Chinese kingdoms, different kingdoms or states, would trade with some countries, but wouldn't trade with others. Even though in most cases, those items, could be used to make tools or for building materials or purposes, but they also have that possibility of being utilized for weapons and more advanced weaponry. So the Chinese, regimes of that time would maybe restrict certain types of trade and certain types of metals with certain countries. Again, that's your classic export control scenario. Over time, at various key points in US history and global history, you see export controls coming into the picture. Whether it's the Revolutionary War, and of course, when our Continental Congress kind of in response to the developments there, started to prohibit exports of goods to Britain, to World War I with a Trading of the Enemy Act, which you see manifested today as the legal basis for why we have sanctions on Cuba. That actually can be tied back to the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Into the Cold War period, when we entered into the Cold War, export controls were very much at the heart of that. The US and the Western powers did not want our more advanced technology, our nuclear technology, our missile technology, our aerospace technology to go to Warsaw Pact countries. And so you saw the form of national rules, national legislation, and international efforts such as COCOM, the Coordinating Committee on Multilateral Export Controls, forming amongst that group of like-minded and like-positioned states. You saw it come after the Iraq War in the 1990s, when it was realized that the first Iraq War, probably when there was even a greater issue involving weapons of mass destruction than the second time around. And that's because when we went in, or the coalition forces went into Iraq that first go around, they found chemical weapons systems, biological weapon systems. Actually, a lot of the things that you heard talked about more in the second Iraq War really actually tied back to the first Iraq War. And it was found that every one of those items had been acquired ultimately through legal means. They weren't smuggled, they weren't stolen, they weren't, the Saddam regime had acquired them, now certainly through some maybe gray area transactions and through some middle persons and other mechanisms. But at the end of the day, there was not a legal regime in place that said that that item couldn't go in this way and end up in Iraq. And so what was introduced then was a set of control measures called catch-all controls, which basically said that if a party knows or should know or has reason to believe that an item is going to a WMD end use, that also is a trigger for a government to take action to manage or regulate or restrict that item. And so again, that was as a means to sort of respond to national governments and in our more modern context, international criminal terrorist and criminal organizations from obtaining items through these surreptitious means, even though technically legally. So there's a few other kind of hallmark points of export controls, and when we look back through history, I think they really, in our current context, I think came to the forefront after 9/11 and the discovery of the Abdul Khan network. He was considered the father of the Pakistan's nuclear capability. Unfortunately, as you saw, probably have seen reported, he was also cited as one of the key actors in a global, basically nuclear supermarket that led to many countries and issues that we're dealing today when it comes to nuclear proliferation and nuclear security challenges. For what it's worth, if you didn't know, A.Q. Khan actually recently passed away. So you may have seen some recent articles or write-ups about him and his legacy, both in some of the positive ways and what he meant to the country of Pakistan, but also certainly that other side where Times Magazine called him once the Merchant of Menace and put him on their cover, not as Person of the Year, but as Merchant of Menace of the Year. So kind of fast forward then from that period of the mid-2000s, you sort of see new, export controls really expanding globally and really becoming intertwined in international relations, in international commercial relations, and of course in now and today, some of our biggest international entanglements. So that's kind of just a brief history of export controls and the kind of impact it has. And I think if you keep that in mind, you'll see and have a better appreciation for how we see export controls manifesting today. So just a few things to kind of talk about it, as we are talking about the global context and the global picture, where export controls are on the global scene and how you sort of see export controls now moving beyond just what was originally maybe a few national practices, maybe a little bit of a multinational practice or a multilateral practice, to an international practice and a set of international norms and standards. And it's happened gradually through a series of treaties and conventions, through actions by the United Nations Security Council, both in a series of general resolutions, but also some specific related to sanctions that you may be familiar with, to the establishment of these multilateral export control regimes, to actions by organizations like the World Customs Organization in introducing export control standards and considerations into customs and trade facilitation and security more broadly, and through regional organizations. Certainly in the case of the European Union, they have a long history now of export control practice. You're seeing other regional integration efforts, initiatives, also adopting export controls as one of their features or elements for regional cohesion. Just some of those examples you see here, some of the treaties like the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Arms Trade Treaty, and as I mentioned, actions by the UN Security Council resolution. One of the most prominent was UN Security Council Resolution 1540 in 2004, which made it an obligation for the first time on UN member states to adopt appropriate and effective export controls, in large part at that time in response to ensuring that strategic items, the types of commodities and technologies that were most concerned about terrorists and other malign actors getting their hands on, that's really what that focus of that UN resolution was. And it passed unanimously, and it was invoked according to Chapter 7 of the UN, and therefore that makes it legally binding, at least according to UN charter practice, on all UN member states. So that was that's sort of part of the international codification and grounding of export controls that we've seen pretty much in the last few decades. What you've also seen, those treaties, they kind of provide the standards and the norms, but they don't really have the ability to do national level implementation or really more the practice of export controls. What kind of standards are going to be used to further those non-proliferation goals, those security goals, those counterterrorism goals, and so on and so forth. That came through the development of these multilateral export control regimes. Now, these are mostly supplier countries that they work together to develop a common set of export control standards and identify the list of goods and technologies that are of greatest concern or that where they feel that export controls should most likely be placed based on the technical capabilities of the items and their increased likelihood for being applied in a military application or a weapons of mass destruction application, chemical, biological, nuclear. Now, these regimes are not legally binding. They're not really even politically binding, technically speaking, although they certainly do have an element of political expectation that come with them. And sometimes you'll actually hear governments refer to their regime obligations as a reason for why they're taking a certain export control action at the national level. So now, with that kind of background and context, let's take a look at the world of export controls. And I want to use this to highlight that, yes, it is, of course, widely practiced by the US and North America and Europe. And yes, those multilateral export control regimes, they do not have an unlimited membership. They're only about 40 or so countries, give or take. And the majority of those countries are North America and European countries. But at that same time, export controls certainly are not only found in those areas, and increasingly they are found in other regions of the world, including in the places where export controls, you might think or believe, were the places that export controls were developed and practiced in the first place. So yeah, export controls during the Cold War period were developed to kind of counter the Eastern Bloc and Soviet countries. Well, Russia now is a member of many of those multilateral export control regimes and has a pretty robust export control system. So does mainland China. So does countries now increasingly in Southeast Asia. So do increasingly countries in the Middle East, and increasingly countries in Latin America. So you really see, I think, the global expansion of export controls by countries, even if they're not members of the multilateral export control regimes. In fact, I think by my count, we have probably about 75 countries out of, let's say there's 200, just to make it easy, countries in the world. I'd say at least 75 have these national export control systems. And I would say at least half of, or almost half of those are outside of those multilateral export control regimes. They adopt these export controls because, some of those reasons I alluded to earlier. Given that, yes, the countries that are part of those regimes are the ones that are some of the biggest international traders, and they are key markets for a lot of the other countries. These countries kind of want to emulate that practice, and they want to also be part of those supply chains, of those technical cooperation opportunities, and of course, defense cooperation opportunities as well. So even though they're not under any obligation, legal, political, or otherwise, many countries like a Singapore, like a Thailand recently, like Oman recently, and the UAE. Those countries are not members of those regimes that I mentioned. They may be members of the UN, of course, in certain treaties, but they're not members of those multilateral export controls regimes, and yet they have adopted systems that look, smell, feel very much like the kinds of systems you have in the US and Europe. And so I think that's a fascinating trend in this area, and it's only continuing, expanding, and growing. So I said you kind of see export controls everywhere, and especially in today's world. And these are just some of the examples of places where you might see it in the headlines. Some of the big cases you hear between the US and China, of course, North Korea. You've heard export controls come up in the COVID-19 context, where countries actually look to their export control systems, in some cases to restrict the provision of PPE or even vaccines or other elements or medical equipment. In some cases, they kind of brought those types of items under their export control systems, where in reality, what you mostly found under there were aerospace and chemicals and other things that are more closely related to military applications and so forth. So that just shows you that sometimes export controls can be used, and I'll let you decide whether that's rightly or wrongly to meet other kind of policy needs or national needs or interests. You interestingly also see export controls a lot in the movies, and some of the biggest, and there's actually, we have a colleague here, Bethany Nelson, who some of you may know, or maybe she's on this meeting today, who's at the UW Export Control Office. And she, I think, is one of those like me who looks for export controls in movies, and you'll see it in a lot, very obviously in movies like Lord of War or War Dogs, about the international arms trade. There's a lot of export control discussion in that, but even more subtly in this scene from Batman, where Bruce Wayne they're being explained how Bruce Wayne got all this fancy technology and equipment that he used to become Batman. And if you remember this scene, they actually talk about the formation of moving items through different end users and different countries that don't have export control regimes to be able to get this more advanced technology that helped him become Batman. So if we often think of Kim Jong-un or maybe certain regimes, or Al-Qaeda maybe as the biggest proliferators in the world. Actually, Batman is actually one of the biggest proliferators that we've seen in the modern times. So keep that in mind. As I said, export controls are literally everywhere, including right down the street or right here in Madison. Here's that office that I mentioned that Bethany Nelson and her colleague Tom Demke work at. You'll see now, if you go pick any university that's in the world, in the US certainly, and increasingly in the world, and I guarantee you they will have an export control page, if not a dedicated export control office. And that's because, remember I said that export controls are moving beyond politics and security. It's even moving beyond commerce and international business to academia and science and technology cooperation. Because some of the technologies, the most advanced, or the ones that maybe could be utilized, if not now or in the future, AI, robotics, quantum computing, machine learning, advanced materials, advanced nanotechnology, biotechnology, all of those things. A lot of that research, of course, is being done in public universities, private universities, research institutes. So they're finding that the world of export controls is kind of coming into their backyard, if not front yard as well. And they're having to understand and find ways to comply with those controls so that that good research and international technology and scientific cooperation can continue. So why do we see export controls everywhere? These are just a few reasons. I think why we're seeing them more and more and more. Because they're being used as a foreign policy tool, as I've already mentioned, because they involve those dual use items. Again, I really cannot emphasize that this phone right here technically can be a dual use item. It is every day, most days, it is civilian, commercial, beneficial, helpful. It could save lives. It can help me communicate with my family. I can conduct business with it. You can do so many things with this. But it also has chips inside that can probably run very advanced, much more advanced systems than even just this phone. It has encryption inside that can be used to protect this phone and the data on it, but also that can be used to protect maybe sensitive military information. It has a gyroscope inside, a gyroscope that can tell me what the GPS of where I'm located and help me, get my pizza order from Domino's tonight. But at the same time, that gyroscope can, and the inertial navigation systems that go along with it can be used to guide a cruise missile. So that's kind of why you see this, export controls really having a much, much more broader scope, maybe in some ways than they were originally intended, because those lines between what is, advanced civilian technology and what is military technology or weapons related technology is becoming increasingly blurred. And so that's why you see export controls taking such prominence in my view. And you also see it the way it's being practiced and implemented, as I mentioned, not just on physical goods or even people, but also on financial transactions. National governments, like everybody else, realize that if you want to figure something out, you follow the money. And so they realize maybe sometimes they can't prevent technology from leaking, maybe they can't prevent items from being smuggled, but when you have something like the US banking system, which almost X% of all currency transactions will have to go through at some way, someplace, way, shape, or form, that's a very, very powerful tool. So if you turn a tool like that as one of in your export control toolkit to maybe prevent the financing for a transaction to go forward, or to punish somebody who violated the rules, or that's trying to gather funds to be able to build their nuclear arsenal, financing and financial markets and currency markets become a very, very powerful export control tool, in addition, again, to their very positive, more everyday uses. So just a few words about some of those things I mentioned, dual use items, why they're so widely spread. I think I've already highlighted this concept of these dual use items, and these are the ones that will often find themselves being subject to export controls and on the control lists that the multilateral regimes adopt and then national governments implement through their national systems. And that's because you have chemicals that can be used in the shampoo that maybe many of us are using some point today or tomorrow or whenever, however often you like to use it. That same key chemical can be used to produce chemical weapons. The same carbon fiber that goes into more advanced tennis rackets can be in you'll be this kind of carbon fiber special materials that can be used in a missile nose cone. The same type of biomedical equipment or freeze drying equipment that can be used to make instant coffee can be used to grow and develop biological weapons. So I think hopefully you see why in some cases, and again, I'm not saying rightly in every case, some very commercial beneficial products, because of their dual use capability, do get caught up in the world of export controls. And that makes that world a lot bigger. I think I already mentioned a lot about, how export controls now apply to people and parties and businesses. Here you can see that reflected in some of the US practice on the right, some of the EU practice and the UN practice. All of these are different lists that are being adopted of people or companies that have violated either some type of rule, oftentimes related to sensitive technology or weapons of mass destruction or military items of some kind, or because they're involved in terrorism and other illicit behaviors or malign behaviors, and they find themselves on these lists. And then these lists get adopted into national systems, like the US list that you see here, which I think by my count has 14 different lists, some of which can have thousands of parties on them. And so businesses, even if, regardless of what you're trading in, you could be trading in this highlighter, but if the way some of these lists are structured, if this highlighter is going to go to a party on one of these lists, I might need to get US permission, US government permission before I send it to that party, even though there's very little chance that this highlighter can be a weapons of mass destruction. Now, maybe it can be used to highlight some technical diagrams or some literature that some nuclear scientist or weapons expert is using in a country that we don't want it to be used in. So certainly it has that potential WMD application. But I think in most days, again, 6.9 days out of 7, this is just a highlighter that myself or my kids are going to use to highlight something that we're reading. Here's the point about the finance and why you're seeing export controls expand in that area. It's kind of very different factors that's happening within the financial world itself. But then again, as I mentioned, the export control world seeing that, hey, that's a pretty good idea what they're doing over there in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. Let's see if we can do some of the same and get some of the same benefits and use it as a tool in our export control practice. So you're seeing that happen. And again, that is a force multiplier and a global expander, given the nature of financial markets when it comes to export controls. And as I mentioned, you're also seeing it happen because of corporate practice. Corporations and businesses at the end of the day are probably going to be the ones most affected by these export controls in many ways, much more than Al-Qaeda and Kim Jong-un. Yeah, certainly they're going to be on the receiving end of export controls, but the parties that have to be day-to-day complying with them and implementing them are legitimate, good, profit-seeking or beneficial corporations. And they have to comply with these rules. And the reason why they do that is because of the risk of violations, the potential damage to reputation, but also some of the financial gains and economic gains they see by having export controls be a comparative advantage. If their compliance practice is something that they can in some ways do better than their competition, they can navigate the export controls, figure out how to get licenses when they need to more quickly, then that becomes a comparative advantage, just like maybe their ability to produce items more quickly. And that becomes therefore a economic advantage and a revenue generator. So that's one of the reasons why you see it. And just some examples from, again, good brands right here in Wisconsin, our colleagues at Kohl's, you'll see them adopting export control and trade and security related policies. Our colleagues at Harley-Davidson, in their supplier code of conduct, they include trade compliance. And see, it says they're not only talking about themselves, they're talking about their supply chain. So this is my point about the export controls as another force multiplier of export controls. The governments aren't making Harley-Davidson do this, at least not directly. Harley-Davidson is doing this, though, to ensure that, to help its own export compliance and to maybe, again, make it more efficient, more effective. that they're making anybody that wants to do business with Harley-Davidson be a supplier. Well, you have to have good export control practice. And you see that really reflected in not only in US-based supply chains, but global supply chains. And you'll see it in BAE Systems, in Hewlett-Packard, in IBM, pretty much anywhere around the world, you'll now start to see these kinds of supplier code of conduct that are pushing export controls out more and more broadly. Again, and that's the corporations doing the government's work for it, which was probably part of the idea if you think about it. All right, so looking at it today, what are some of the good, bad, and ugly of export controls? Then I'll wrap up, and hopefully we have good time for questions and discussion. You know, you kind of see it certainly in US practice. You see kind of one of the modes of export controls being utilized as in a more forceful way. You know, some people have gone so far to say, well, sometimes the US and governments weaponize export controls. Certainly, you know, I don't like to really use that term too loosely, but you certainly see it, you know, using it as a tool of foreign policy, and maybe again, not a feather tool, but a hammer. And where you see that is where the US is introducing and expanding its national controls, going beyond those multilateral regime lists, and not only looking at identified sensitive technologies, but quotes emerging technologies in many of those categories that I mentioned. And you know, so things that maybe in some ways we don't really know the full application of, or still are a very early phase of applied research, you know, basic foundational research, and not really at the point of applied. So, and yet still the way the US export control system is going, whereas before much of that technology was kind of exempted from the world of export controls, now you're seeing more of it, more and more of it brought in. And if you look, interestingly, kind of just to give you another perspective, at the list of emerging and foundation technologies that the US is focusing on, it kind of matches up with China's 2025 plan for all the technology areas that China wants to use as part of its civil military fusion initiative. So, you know, that kind of gives you a sense of maybe some of the motivations or rationales for why the US is taking steps like that. And not surprisingly, then you see export controls really being kind of a key at the center of a lot of the tensions and conflicts and adversarial relationships that we currently see between the US and some potential adversaries like China, like Russia, in addition to the ones that are, I think, more kind of universally problematic, like North Korea and in many cases Iran. And I think so you're likely to see kind of continuation of these measures for not only these types of concerns, but you're increasingly seeing them being implemented and applied for a broader set of kind of new security concerns, human security, human rights. You know, the EU just recently adopted a whole new export control regulation, and one of the provisions that it put in is actually similar to that catch-all control that I described in the case of the Iraq WMD program. What the European Union did was adopt a similar provision, but it says if you know an item is going to a human rights abuse or in violation of human rights, you know, by a party or person or a use that fits that bill, then you have to go and get government permission before you export it. And again, it could be back to this highlighter. So the EU and other countries are following and introducing similar types of measures in their national export control system. So you're seeing the export controls being applied beyond hard security, beyond kind of maybe the more traditional kind of power politics foreign policy, and moving into more human security and kind of quotes new security areas. You know, like I said, we saw it in COVID situation, in the health security area. You know, you'll probably kind of start to see it if you haven't already in the environmental security area. And again, that's kind of why we're seeing this expansion of export controls around the world. These are just some examples of that. And again, your US is not the only one doing this by any means. you'll see countries like China responding many ways in kind. So if you look back over the last couple of years in China, they've also adopted their own export controls that in some ways are now aimed at or reflected at the US and some of the US interests. And in some ways, they are very much US-like policies and US-like export control practices that are now being, many would say, being used and applied towards the US. And so that's kind of another reason why export controls you see figure so prominently in the current US-China dynamic. These are some of the other kind of trends I alluded to, and I think I've already covered, so I don't want to spend time on that. I did, as I noted, you're seeing a really big expansion of export controls, particularly in Southeast Asia. So like I said, it's not just the big established economies, it's a lot of emerging economies. They're doing it. It could be for any one of those reasons: international obligation, national security or international security, regional initiatives, or increasingly economic and business reasons, and technology cooperation reasons, because they want to be part of those global supply chains that now are kind of pipelines established by export control pipelines. And you kind of need to have a level playing field and similar standards and practices if you want to be part of those supply chains. So that's some of the reasons why you're seeing many of these countries adopt those systems. And I also want to say, though, it's not all negative and doom and gloom. I kind of want to end here my comments on a positive note that, export controls are also increasingly being used as in a positive way in global trade and security, as part of relationship building, as part of the regional integration and harmonization efforts that I alluded to. It's helping, and you're seeing a lot of the countries develop export controls systems. You're also seeing it develop modernized financial systems, less bureaucracy in many ways, modernized trade and customs modernization systems, better port and trade infrastructure, although that's kind of been subject to a whole nother set of issues now. So you see export controls, and I don't know if you could say it's the cause or effect of all that, but you're certainly seeing it happening in tandem with a lot of these other economic development indicators across the globe. And then finally, you see it fostering a lot of goodwill and cooperation, both in terms of government communities and industry communities. And here are just a few examples. The one on the right is a recent export control exchange program that took place between the US and Vietnam that I participated in as part of some of the work that I do for the US government in the world of export control cooperation. You'll see organizations, like I said, the World Customs Organization integrating export controls into its outreach and its customs modernization programs. And you're seeing industry communities like this. It's a little funny name, but the Defense Export Control Conference is really a big export control, Defense Exports Conference is really a big export control conference with representatives from all around the world, some of the major industries that are touched by export controls, coming together, sharing best practices, and building cooperation in the world of export controls, because they all have to comply. So I think I'll stop my comments there. I think we had some questions, and I hope we get some more, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, Jay, thank you so much. The first question is the U.S. one of the largest sources of guns going to troublemakers throughout the world?
Is the U.S. one of the so the U.S. is one of the world's biggest arms suppliers. I think typically as you see there's an annual report. There's several annual reports that are put out by various outlets. What is it? CIPRI in the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the Grimmett Report produced by the State Department, a whole host of others. And usually you'll find the US at the top of that list, other major arms suppliers, of course, are Russia and China, and then it kind of falls off after that, although there are other major ones. And I think certainly U.S. arms and military equipment does find its way into conflict zones and into the hands of those it was hopefully not intended for, but maybe sometimes there are cases where those types of systems and equipment does get into the hands of bad actors. I think at the same time, I would say the U.S. also, though, has one of the most robust systems for regulating arms transfers and military equipment transfers. I think the U.S. is widely recognized as having one of a very stringent defense export control system. It's one that causes a lot of pain for our allies as much as it does our potential adversaries and those that we don't want to have those weapons. So, yes, U.S. is at the top of some of those lists in many cases, but is also, I think, one of the biggest in trying to actually prevent the flow of those arms to some of those bad actors.
Okay, now the next question is, what's the relationship between export controls and the TPP in terms of why many in the U.S. wanted to stay out of the TPP?
It's interesting. That's a great question, and it kind of gets to a bigger issue that I didn't really touch on, although probably should have, is how export controls figure in relation to other types of international trade arrangements, the World Trade Organization, free trade agreements, and so on and so forth. And in many cases, export controls are separate from those trade arrangements and immune from them. So that even if a arrangement or a partnership like the TPP was established, they oftentimes, there are clauses in those arrangements or exceptions or national reservations that state that they will not maybe stand in the way of a country implementing trade measures for security purposes, non-proliferation purposes, and so on and so forth. That's kind of a crude paraphrasing of it. So in actuality, you don't really see a direct connection between something like the TPP and export controls, in my opinion.
Okay, now the next question is, do you see governments making more use of export controls than tariffs in the coming years to affect trade flows?
That's an excellent question. And it's interesting because, in certain very big cases, of course, like China, you've actually seen both, right? And you could argue that, the tariffs and quotas got as much of a response or had as much of an impact, if not greater impact, than the export controls did or have. So it's hard to say, going forward, how that's going to play out. I would say that I think, though, given the type of where the concern is, in that, ideally, if you think about the U.S. export control policy and a lot of countries' policy, you hear the statement, higher fences around a smaller set of items. So in that sense, I think the ideal is to allow the trade in the less sensitive items or the less likely to be utilized for a bad purpose or a bad actor or in a quote bad place. You want that trade to go, especially in a world like today where we're having supply chain disruption, et cetera. So in some ways, I think tariffs are really counter to that mission. But export controls you can still have around your technology crown jewels, around the more sensitive items, and you can increasingly raise the bar of those export controls and restrict those items to a greater and greater degree, potentially having less and less economic impact. So in that sense, I guess my answer to that would be, you may actually see, comparatively speaking, or at least to what we've seen today, a comparative increase in the rate of export control usage than you will in tariff usage going forward.
Okay. And Jay, do you think that trade is the best hope for long-term peace between the U.S. and China?
You know, I think that's probably, I think it's certainly been something that's helped contribute to the peace thus far. And I think it is something that will continue to keep us, you know, keep that us inextricably connected. And so in that sense, I do see it as a really important piece of you know, U.S.-China kind of peace go in the longer term. You know, I say that though, knowing that, you know, at least what you hear from China, and I'm sure the U.S. has its own kind of red lines that, you know, and I've heard some colleagues and some people say that you know, if certain red lines were crossed, let's say a Taiwan-related red line of a certain type, all of that potentially could go out the window. You know, that there are some statements that China would be willing to go, you know, never mind the trade relationship and the economic impact, and then, you know, pursue that in a kind of adversarial way. Which again, I'm not going to reserving a comment on their policy. I'm just saying what the response is and how they might view the trade relationship from their perspective in certain cases. But that said, you know, I think generally China, you know, from my experience, both sides do not want to have any type of real conflicts. And I think trade only decreases, you know, that possibility because it makes us so connected going forward.
Okay, Jay, and the next questioner would like to hear more about export controls via the financial market. And what does this mean for crypto? Does it not pose a threat to control through this lens?
That's interesting. And I will tell you that the issue of cryptocurrency and export controls is they're just kind of looking at that now in many ways. I mean, again, for many people, cryptocurrency, you know, even I would say for myself, is kind of a very new thing on any level. You know, just and how much it's being utilized now, or could be utilized in everyday, you know, international business and commercial transaction and so forth. So you are seeing, you know, the ways you can see export controls and more broadly sanctions affecting cryptocurrency is that in some ways, if the controls, if a sanctions is in place, a financial sanction that says you cannot transfer money to this party, in many ways, it doesn't matter the method by which it's being transferred. You know, in and of itself, like if you would be in violation of the sanctions, whether you're handing the person cash, whether you're writing them a check, you're doing a wire transfer, or you're doing cryptocurrency transfer. Now you're probably getting at, well, it's a lot harder to track, to see whether maybe somebody's using cryptocurrency to do an end around a sanctions, because, you know, anybody can create a random profile and open a certain crypto account, and sometimes it's very hard to figure out and tie that back to an actual person or business account. Well, they're actually now developing software tools. One you can want to look at if you're interested is called Ciphertrace, that is giving national governments and law enforcement authorities the ability to track cryptocurrency transactions. And you're increasingly seeing it being used in counter sanctions financing, counterterrorism financing, and counterproliferation financing. So yes, cryptocurrency, you know, it could be doing a lot of good things for our financial future. It also, you know, can be used to kind of evade sanctions and be used for ill purposes. But export controls kind of world is trying to catch up with that and develop responses that will hopefully prevent that bad side from progressing.
And the last question, Jay, is the recent flap over U.S. nuclear submarines for Australia opens up the question of whether or not our submarines should be subject to controls, export controls.
So actually, our submarines are very much subject to export controls. Any U.S. military, any military system or equipment that comes from the U.S. would be subject to our most stringent export controls. Now, there are, as I mentioned, you can calibrate your export controls and use them in a, let's say, a positive relationship building way, because there are things like foreign military sales, which have special rules that apply to them, as well as any kind of government action or many government actions that involve the transfers of whether it's military technology or other types of dual use or highly regulated technology. In many of the rules and regulations and policies, there are carve-outs or maybe a slightly different set of procedures that allow those types of transactions for those systems to go forward when we want them. And of course, we do want them. We do want to have defense cooperation be a kind of a hallmark of our international relationships, our security relationships, our strategic relationships. So, and of course, we don't want our export controls to stand in the way of those goals. And so, yeah, the systems do have carve-outs. They do have special mechanisms and procedures that can be followed that would allow something like the sale of these submarines to go forward, even though in every other day they would be subject to the most stringent export controls.
Jay, thank you so much. As you can tell, this was a very interesting topic to people who are participating tonight. And I think we all have learned a lot, and we are in your debt for that. And thanks so much again, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Melanie. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for being with us tonight, and to the MCFR. We look forward to future cooperation with you at MITA, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Okay, goodbye.
All right, thanks. Take care.